Have tech companies gotten so big that it's bad for the economy? Senator Elizabeth Warren says so. She's proposing to break up not one, but several tech giants, including Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. She says they shouldn't be allowed to both run distributor platforms and compete on them. It's like being an umpire and a team owner at the same time, she says. Spotify co-founder and CEO Daniel Ek not calling for a breakup, but he is calling for an overhaul, specifically when it comes to Apple. He's pointing to the same issue Warren is. Apple is charging Spotify to operate on its app store, but then also competing with Spotify in the same store. So, is there a problem here? Should big tech be broken up? If not, should regulators step in to change the rules? Welcome to Fortt Knox, Rich Ideas and Powerful People. I'm John Fortt from CNBC here at the NASDAQ market site overlooking Times Square. This week, I'm joined by Wired senior editor Lauren Good, and here with me, New York Times tech columnist Kevin Roose. Joining us in just a bit, former FCC chairman Tom Wheeler, author of a new book, From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future. And later on in the podcast, Dominique Mocino is a playwright, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and her musical Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Times of the Temptations opens on Broadway this month. A unique innovator shares her journey, and you don't want to miss that. But first, do the big tech platforms need a breakup, boundaries, or just the status quo? Is everything really fine? Here's the argument that Senator Warren makes. Take a listen.
I'm deeply concerned right now that the space around companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google is now referred to by venture capitalists as the kill zone. Because if you try to step a small business into that, one of two things happens. It either gets bought up when it shows its worth, and before it can actually grow into something that's really strong and valuable, or it just gets wiped out.
A lot of people would argue getting bought up by Amazon or Google is not exactly a bad outcome. Kevin, is there a problem here or just sore losers?
Well, I was just at South by Southwest in Austin. I was talking to people on both sides of this issue, and I think there was some sort of broad agreement that big tech has gotten very powerful and something should be done to address that. But people really disagree about the solutions. So this kill zone that Senator Warren mentioned, I heard some people saying, yes, this is absolutely a problem. You can't start a small social network because Facebook will either, copy and crush you, or they'll buy you, or something else will happen in the e-commerce business with Amazon. But I've also heard people saying, well, this gives VCs exit paths. This gives people acquisition opportunities. I talked to one CEO who said that her business would not have grown without the ability to advertise on Facebook. So there really is there are trade-offs involved, and I think that the solutions need to be very narrowly targeted to the actual problems.
Lauren, is this a problem from the people that you're talking to about this from your perspective, or is it just a reality that there are a lot of big companies out there in a lot of different areas, and you have to learn how to navigate between them to avoid getting crushed by giants?
I think what I'm hearing echoes a lot of what Kevin just said, and that this actually has to be a much more nuanced conversation. And people feel, to paraphrase Ben Thompson, who wrote this in the Stratechery blog, a lot of people feel that something needs to be done about big tech, but it doesn't necessarily need to be this broad, sweeping breakup of big tech. It's also worth pointing out that, just breaking up big tech or calling out antitrust perhaps, calls back to an era when that type of solution needed to be addressed, like in the era of Microsoft. But the way in which we use tech these days and consume tech these days is so vastly different from 20 years ago that new considerations need to be put into the equation.
But there's a lot of something ought to be done, Laura. I mean, it seems like we've heard Yelp complaining about Google for a long time. The argument kind of similar that, hey, they run a search engine. It's a platform for finding stuff. They promise to connect people to the best stuff. But then, hey, for this much space at the top of the results, they're just connecting people to more Google stuff and crowding others out. Plus, they're dominant, arguably have monopoly power. I mean, is it time to go beyond something ought to be done and actually do something?
I mean, I think so, but I think that you need to take into consideration how each of these unique marketplaces work. Like, for example, this morning, Spotify filed a complaint with the EU Commission about the way that Apple operates its App Store. And that call is specifically around what's known as the Apple tax, this idea that Apple is going to charge app developers on its platform 30% of a revenue for any in-app purchase or subscription that is made through their platform. And that's something that's very specific to that platform. It's a very nuanced sort of agreement. There are all kinds of little, stringent things that go on in the App Store where you can't link out to your own platform to encourage people to buy something off platform, right? And those are things that need to be really gone through with a fine-tooth comb in order to figure out how to best address those, rather than just say split up the App Store from Apple.
Kevin, in a way, that App Store structure is a legacy of iTunes, where Apple was getting a cut of the individual song download purchase and giving the rest to the labels, publishers, et cetera. But has that kind of outgrown its usefulness? Do they need to change it? And I think part of what Daniel Ek was arguing is it's not just about the tax, it's also about the limits on our ability to even contact our own customers if we choose not to play Apple's way and pay them this tax.
Yeah, I absolutely think these sort of App Store taxes, whether it's the Apple tax or something roughly equivalent in the Google Play Store for Android, these are really big taxes to levy on smaller competitors. It's really like these platforms have natural monopolies. You can't get onto iPhones without going through the iOS store. And so they get to set the terms of that engagement. I think that's a really powerful anti-competitive problem.
But on the other hand, if you want your product in Target or Walmart, you got to give them a cut. They're not just going to put it in there and let you sell it for $100 and then hand you $100.
Right, and I think that's the argument these platforms would make, is that these app stores require some maintenance. You have to hire people to approve the apps and make sure they're secure. But this is such a big part of existing as an online service in the time we live in that it's time to, I think, rethink that. And I really do think these sort of app store taxes are one way. Another thing I was surprised that Senator Warren didn't bring up is the fact that some of these companies own cloud businesses. I mean, Amazon has Amazon Web Services. Google has its own cloud platform. Microsoft has a cloud platform. They are literally building the infrastructure that runs the entire internet. And I think there's an argument to be made that they shouldn't be able to do that, given that they also build very popular consumer services that compete with a lot of the ones that they're hosting.
But isn't that like saying that anybody who has an operating system can't build apps? I mean, because on the one hand, yes, these are big, powerful companies with these cloud platforms. On the other hand, there are a lot of them. I mean, Microsoft's got a cloud platform, Amazon's got a cloud platform, IBM, Oracle, on down the line. All these companies have cloud platforms. It's not like you're stuck with just one if you don't want to be competed with.
Right, but you're stuck with a handful. It's an oligopolist system rather than a monopoly. But I think the sort of harm here is that these companies have grown so large that they're able to, I mean, this is Senator Warren's argument that it's actually decreasing competition. And I think you can see that reflected in some of the small business, startup statistics. You can see that there's just not as much activity in areas like social media because the assumption is that you're either going to get copied and crushed or you're going to get bought out.
Laura, how does the innovation ecosystem bear that out from where you sit? Because we hear a lot about SoftBank, others pouring billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions in some cases, into these funds. Granted, a lot of it is going to already mature, already pretty dominant companies in their little fields, like the Ubers, et cetera. But, I mean, how can both things be true? How can these giants be crushing competition, but on the other hand, all of this money be out there for DoorDash, for Uber, for Lyft, for all these companies that are trying to raise?
I think it's a really good question. And to your earlier point that you started off the show with, for some people, maybe having a big exit or just getting sucked up by one of the big tech companies is actually not a bad thing for them. But I think when you look at some of the key acquisitions that have been made in recent years by Facebook, by Amazon, by Google, there is this sense that it would be really difficult to start a company like that these days. And that's both because, yes, of the flow of capital, but it also has a lot to do with just knowing saying that if you start a startup that is remotely appealing to Amazon, perhaps there's a chance they're going to bring you in for an exploratory meeting, and while you're there, launch a service that's just like yours and effectively just cut you off at the knees. I mean, this is like something that happens, right? So it is something I think that is a real concern around innovation and the risks that people are willing to take now, almost unrelated to capital, around how they could potentially compete with these giants.
Yes, indeed. This is Fortt Knox. We are talking about, well, should big tech be broken up? Is that even a viable solution? Is there really even a big problem here, or are the smaller, minnows complaining about the sharks? Kevin, always useful to look at history. And Senator Warren brought up history, Microsoft versus Google, but she sort of did it in a weird way, arguing that, aren't you glad that we have Google now and not just Microsoft Bing for searches? Which historically, I guess in a way, maybe she was arguing that if Windows had been allowed to bundle and be dominant, they would have tied search to the browser and their search would have been the only option and we wouldn't have had Google. But that still isn't quite historically correct.
Right, because Bing was started in 2009, like many years after Google. So I think that point I didn't quite understand. I think the larger sort of historical view is that there's this sort of shifting attitude toward antitrust, right? We had this notion for many years that the test for antitrust was whether consumers were harmed, whether, companies were using their market power to jack up prices and charge more to the consumer. Now you have this kind of sort of hipster antitrust, they call it, this kind of like Brandeisian idea that the thing that matters is not consumer harm, that because a lot of these services are free or very cheap to customers, it's actually just the market concentration itself that is worrisome.
It's more of an EU flavor of antitrust. In the European Union, it's not the consumer you're protecting, it's competition that you're protecting.
Exactly, and I think that's a valid point. I mean, look, we don't have, these are not hypotheticals, right? Facebook for many years operated an app called Onavo, which was a VPN that people installed on their phones that would give Facebook data about which apps those people were using. And that's how Facebook figured out that it was going to acquire WhatsApp, because it knew that they were gaining a lot of traction. That's unfair. That's like, that data is not available to every company. So I think there's a real, these are not hypothetical harms. These are actually taking place in the market.
Okay, but Lauren,
I just want to jump in on that.
Please do, but I want to make a metaphor here. It seems to me, and I'm not a huge football fan, but it's almost like saying, look how many times the New England Patriots have won. And I'm not personally a Patriots fan, but whatever. We need to break up the New England Patriots because they just keep winning. I mean, is just bigness or success, lack of competition in and of itself a good reason for an antitrust ruling in the United States? Well,
I mean, to extend that analogy, it's not just looking at whether they've won a lot, it's looking at whether they've deflated the football, right? So, I mean, this is the kind of thing where, years ago when the Microsoft antitrust case was going on, the question around whether or not they were, I guess, putting their browser first, right, on their operating system. At the time, that was a big topic of conversation, and whether or not they could have potentially, I agree, I don't really follow Warren's argument there around Bing, since Bing came much later, but whether or not they could have dominated search. Okay, fine, that was the conversation we're having then. Now, the way that we get software is so different from back then. The way we get our hands on software, that we downloaded things. That barrier to entry is so much lower that it's not really a question about just obtaining the software. It's those little things that Kevin is talking about that kind of, slip in the side door, like Onavo, or the things I was talking about earlier, where you're in an app store and there are all this little fine print around what you can and can't do in order to establish yourself in an app store. Those are the things that we need to be looking at more carefully to determine what is actually anti-competitive or not.
Indeed. And now I want to bring in former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, once again, author of the new book, From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future. Tom, you've touched a number of big issues and controversies in your time, both in private industry and in government. What do you make of this latest argument that not one company, one tech company in one industry, but a whole bunch of them, many of them competing with each other, are all so big that they all need to be broken up?
Well, I think it's important that we do make sure that it's antitrust policies that allowed the expansion of a competitive market that delivered the kind of realities that we experience today. and that we need to be promoting antitrust in multiple areas. One area is the question of breakup, but there are other areas as well, such as mergers. And are we going to have significant merger review? And the third area is there needs to be regulatory enforcement of antitrust concepts as well. You know, in the open internet rules that we did, for instance, that was a pro-competitive action that had at its heart the same kind of duty to deal concepts that are at the heart of antitrust.
Yeah, but Tom, it seems to me like some of the arguments that are being made today aren't on the same legal basis that we're used to dealing with. Like it's not enough to be a monopoly or have monopoly power. That in and of itself isn't supposed to be the problem, right? It's abuse of that monopoly power that actually harms consumers. But it seems like there's a new argument for a new standard. Maybe consumers don't have to be harmed. They don't have to be paying higher prices necessary, but competition has to be harmed. And so I wonder, do you think the standard needs to change? Or am I just looking at this landscape differently and there's harm that I'm not seeing?
No, I think you make a very interesting and valid observation. The standard has changed. You know, about 40 years ago, Robert Bork and the Chicago School began working to change the underlying concept in antitrust law. Previously, it had been exemplified by Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice, and others as what is the impact on the functioning of the competitive market. For the last 40 years, and with the current judicial system that we have, the folks in place in the judiciary, there has been a change to what's called the consumer welfare standard. And that is what's the impact of this on consumers, particularly on consumers measured by price, which raises a fascinating question. In a digital world where things are, quote, free, how do you make a determination based on a price-based consumer welfare standard? And so we need to be developing new rules. My thesis in the book From Gutenberg to Google is that we had new rules that came in with the Industrial Revolution because we found that agrarian mercantilism didn't work in industrial capitalism. And we had things like antitrust, consumer protection, worker protection. And I think we now find ourselves in the Internet revolution, finding that the rules that were established for the industrial capitalism may not work for internet capitalism. And we need to have that kind of a debate.
Well, and Tom, I have a question for you. During your time at the FCC, there was a lot of questions about net neutrality, and a lot of the big tech companies called foul on this idea that the big telecom companies would be able to use their market power to provide unfair advantages to certain services or others. And now you have these same companies, a lot of them, saying, well, it's okay when we have monopoly power. When the telecoms have it, that's really bad for everyone, but it's fine if we have, 70, 80, 90% of a market.
Yeah, I'm for openness. I think that you need to have open markets, whether it be in the network or in the services that travel on the network. The reality I faced at the FCC was the statute that we operated under allowed us only to deal with networks. That isn't an excuse to walk away from that principle and the consumer protection and competition promotion that results from that.
Yeah, Lauren, Kevin and Tom together make a really interesting point. No, go ahead. Ask your question. Sorry.
I wanted to ask Tom a follow-up question based on what you said earlier about this idea of trying to measure what are essentially free internet services now, because I think if you talk to a lot of these companies, they would say even if we're offering a free service, there are software engineers who we have to hire. There's a lot of manpower that we have to put into things. Then even if you're an e-commerce company, you might still be selling physical goods, which of course require a lot of capital investment. So the internet has become a conduit for these goods, but we're still paying for these goods. So how do you suggest that regulators begin to measure and account for the quality and the value of goods now in this digital age?
So like I said, I think that we need to say that the rules that worked for industrial capitalism need to be reassessed for internet capitalism to address the kind of questions you raise. I can't sit here and say, well, here are the three things that have to happen, but I do think that they begin with openness and a duty to deal, whether you are a network or somebody that operates on the network. And secondly, a duty of care, which is that your job is to do more than to build software products that can go out and deliver these kinds of things, but to think, what are the impact of that? And how do I mitigate the adverse impacts of what I'm building?
I bet shareholders would have some problem with that. It's kind of a holistic, feel good, ethical mission that doesn't necessarily get to the bottom line. It's interesting. But Kevin, something you said, connecting this to net neutrality, I found really interesting because it seems that just a couple of years ago, we were talking about the importance of distribution in the terms of the carriers, the ISPs, the wireless carriers being the distributors. But now this conversation is about the platforms really being the distributors. Amazon is an essential conduit to the consumer. Apple, the App Store, is an essential conduit to the consumer, is what Spotify is arguing. Same thing for Google, same thing for Facebook. And if the argument behind net neutrality was non-discrimination based on the type of traffic, isn't that the same argument Daniel Ek is making, that, hey, my traffic as Spotify is being treated differently from Apple's because they're preferring their own app, and that's wrong? Why shouldn't the same pro-net neutrality heat be coming down on Apple right now that was coming down on the ISPs a few years ago?
It's a great question. I think that's a really interesting point. And I also think we should underscore the fact that what people are objecting to is not just the size of these companies. It's actually how they're using that size to advantage themselves. It's not just that Amazon is big, it's that it is using the data that it collects and the intelligence that it has about the marketplace and what people are buying to then create its own private label goods that can, sort of muscle out competition. It's not just the fact that Facebook and Google are, huge players in the ad market that people are objecting to. It's how they're using that power to squash competition. So I think just looking at this as a problem of size really misses the point here, that it's how that size is being implemented and used, and the weight that these companies are able to throw around in the market.
Lauren, what about it? I mean, could it be that the whole model is outdated, thinking of the FCC being mainly about airwaves and spectrum, and that's what distribution really is? In the data era, could these platforms be just as much valid distributors and perhaps in need of specific rules and oversight?
So, one of the interesting points that I make in my book, From Gutenberg to Google, is that we've moved from a centralized network system where there was a railroad or the telephone, whatever it was, you came into a central point to be switched out, to a distributed network, the internet-based protocol. And what's happened is that on top of that distributed network, you now have virtual centralization, which is the platforms that you have been talking about. The point remains that there needs to be openness every step along the way, whether it is openness in the network or openness in the service and the assets that those services use to create their own, to extract their own monopoly rents.
Right.
And that's the data that they hold.
Right.
So, interconnection works for networks. Interconnection ought to work for data. And yes, there should be a similar kind of concept.
Lauren, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I can tell you from a consumer experience that if I were to take this phone right now with my little wired pop socket and I were to use Siri to try to call up a Spotify song, and I pay $10 a month for Spotify Premium, it would default to Apple Music. Same as when I plug this phone into my car and let's say I was listening to a Spotify song, it defaults to Apple Music. There are little things like that that are happening across all of these platforms that have to do with the prioritization. That's the choice of the platform to prioritize their own content or their own product over others. And so it comes back to that conversation, not just about, okay, whether or not this is antitrust in the traditional sense, but whether these small things that are happening that are anti-competitive, that are building up into a much bigger problem.
Very good point. A lot of these services and platforms aren't speaking to each other or to apps that compete with their own. Once again, this is Fortt Knox, rich ideas, powerful people. We were talking about this platform issue, big tech, should it be broken up? And Kevin, I'm not sure I see how breaking up these companies necessarily solves these problems that we're talking about.
Well, I don't know that it does on its own. And again, I think these solutions have to be narrowly tailored because all of these companies are abusing their power in very different ways. But for something like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, right, all owned by Facebook, I think there's an argument to be made that separating those three, that having them be independent companies, would actually improve the social media ecosystem as a whole, that if they were forced to compete for users and advertising dollars, that these services would be better for consumers. I also think there's an argument that, that consumers would be better off if all of this data were not warehoused under one company's roof.
Right. I think that's the key point. You've just hit on the key point, which is, okay, so you spin Instagram off, and Instagram does not have access to the kind of granular data that Facebook does. Can it effectively compete? And that calls into question. So again, you go back to basic principles. Interconnection of networks is what created the internet. But Tom, you need to have interconnection of the assets that ride on those networks.
But where does it stop? Why shouldn't you say, okay, we're also going to split YouTube off from Google? Oh, we're going to split DoubleClick off from Google, and once you start chopping off limbs of these various things, I'm not sure where it ends. I remember YouTube before Google. Right. It actually wasn't that great. I mean, there was practically no good video on the internet. There's a lot of clunky Flash stuff, so it was nice to have a central repository. But arguably, YouTube's been a positive source and voice for the expansion of video on the internet. I mean, might it be going a bit far to just go through with a cleaver and chopping off limbs from all these companies?
I think you're missing my point. I'm not sitting here advocating that we break up Google into 6 smaller Googles. It's an idea that many are pursuing and is worth pursuing. What I'm saying, though, is what is it that gives Google and DoubleClick and YouTube and all of its parts, Android, the ability to have the market power that they have? And the answer to that is their control, their collection, control, and hoarding of vast amounts of data that others can't get access to. So let's think about what happens if you interconnect to that data and allow other competitors to come in and offer innovative services and not have this wall that keeps them from being effectively competitive because they don't have the data, which is what people buy.
Lauren, last word. What about the argument that what actually makes them powerful is the fact that they just did what they did better than the others? I mean, Yahoo used to have more data. It kind of didn't make it. I could name, and I'm sure you could too, dozens of other companies that had lots of either data or other assets but didn't execute.
That's right. I mean, a lot of it does come down to the consumer experience and the fact that a lot of these services have become so popular because they provided value in some way and people have enjoyed using them. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep coming back. Google has vast amounts of data on all of us, but we're able to use Google for search, which I think people would argue is certainly one of the benefits of the platform. I mean, another question that arises from all this, which is related, but not the same, is content moderation is a big topic right now too. And so, if these companies were to be just cleaved off, how would each of them handle content moderation without the resources, perhaps, of the giant parent company that provides some of the tools with which to do that?
So let's go back on history 1 second. You raise a very good point. Facebook beat MySpace. MySpace was owned by Rupert Murdoch, for heaven's sakes. Facebook beat MySpace in a good, old-fashioned, I got a better product kind of environment. Could a new Facebook come along today and beat Facebook when the asset that Facebook monetizes is access to the records of 2.25 billion people? And somebody comes up and says, hey, I've got 100 million people. It doesn't count. You can't compete. That's the challenge. And that's why we have to go to the heart and say, what is it that would enable competition, and that's interconnection of the data.
It is a convincing argument. It sounds a bit like the one about Windows market share that I recall from, almost 20 years ago. But great insight from everyone here. Tom Wheeler, Lauren Good, Kevin Roos, thanks for being with us. This has been Fortt Knox. Rich ideas, powerful people. Should the big tech companies get broken up? I personally am not convinced, mainly because the legal basis is unclear. But this idea of having an equivalent of the FCC for big data platforms, now that's interesting. Up next on the podcast, Dominique Mocino, the playwright, Genius Grant recipient. Don't miss that. Here it is. And this has been Fortt Knox live from the NASDAQ market site. We'll see you next time.